I transferred $25,000 to my mother to pay for an urgent cancer surgery, and 3 weeks later, I saw her posting photos from a trip to Europe with her new boyfriend. When I confronted her, she said I owed her this. The social media app notification flashed on my cell phone screen on a cold Monday morning, while I was drinking black coffee in my silent apartment, still trying to emotionally process the last months of family anguish that had completely consumed my mental energy and financial stability carefully built over 15 years of career as a business consultant. The characteristic notification sound cut through the morning silence like an alarm siren, abruptly interrupting my sacred ritual of reviewing work emails and planning the week's meetings with the organizational precision that had made me a reference in the corporate market for my technical competence and religious compliance with established deadlines. When I swiped my finger across the screen to view the update that had arrived, I found a sequence of colorful and radiant photographs that made me feel as if the solid floor of my apartment had literally disappeared beneath my feet, leaving me falling in free fall through an emotional abyss that fundamentally questioned everything I believed I knew about honesty, maternal love, and especially about the nature of people in whom we place our most absolute and unconditional trust. There was Regina, my 62-year-old mother, who supposedly was recovering from a complex and painful oncological surgery performed 3 weeks earlier, posing happily in front of the famous Leaning Tower. Her blonde hair perfectly arranged shining under the Mediterranean sun, while she smiled radiantly at the professional camera that had captured that moment of tourist happiness that contrasted dramatically with the tears of pain and despair I had witnessed during our phone conversations about her supposed deteriorated health condition. Her expensive and elegant clothes, which I immediately recognized as new pieces that cost more than my monthly salary, matched perfectly with the imported leather shoes and designer purse she proudly displayed while posing next to Mauricio, her tanned 53-year-old boyfriend who had mysteriously appeared in her life 6 months earlier with vague stories about successful international career and lucrative investments that he could never explain in detail when questioned about specifics. The photo caption simply said, "Living the best moments of my life with my love in Italian lands," accompanied by heart emojis and precise geographic location that unequivocally confirmed they were really on the other side of the ocean, freely spending the money I had desperately transferred from my emergency account after weeks of elaborate emotional blackmail about urgent medical treatments that couldn't wait for bureaucratic health insurance authorizations. My vision became blurred by tears of rage and disbelief that instantly sprang from my eyes as I frantically scrolled through dozens of other photographs that meticulously documented a complete luxury trip, expensive restaurants with sophisticated dishes, 5-star hotels with panoramic views of historic landscapes, romantic gondola rides, and especially genuine smiles of two people who clearly weren't worried about serious medical issues or financial limitations that should accompany expensive oncological treatments. Each image I viewed was like receiving a direct stab to the heart, especially when I noticed the luxurious details that revealed exactly where my hard-earned money had been spent. The gold watch on Mauricio's wrist that cost more than my car, the expensive jewelry on Regina's neck and ears that she had never owned before my bank transfer, and especially the expression of absolute satisfaction on both their faces that clearly demonstrated they knew exactly what they were doing and didn't feel even a trace of guilt or remorse for the elaborate fraud they had orchestrated against me. The emotional weight of the betrayal was amplified by the vivid memory of how I had stayed awake nights researching oncological treatments on the internet, calling renowned specialists to get referrals for competent doctors, and especially obsessively calculating how I could completely reorganize my financial life to cover all the medical costs Regina claimed were necessary to save her life. During the 3 weeks before that devastating morning, I had lived in a constant state of paralyzing anxiety about Regina's supposed medical condition, canceling important work meetings to accompany her to medical appointments that apparently never existed, completely reorganizing my professional schedule to be available whenever she needed emotional support during what I believed was an intensive treatment period, and especially carrying a terrible psychological weight of guilt for not being able to do more to help financially a mother who claimed to be fighting a potentially fatal disease. The discovery that everything had been an elaborate and calculated lie made me question not only my judgment capacity about close people, but also my own mental sanity. How had it been possible to be so completely deceived by someone I had known for 37 years and who supposedly loved me unconditionally? My fingers trembled violently as I held the cell phone, alternating between scrolling through the incriminating photographs and trying to mentally process the magnitude of the betrayal that had been committed against me by a person who should represent protection, honesty, and unconditional maternal love in my life. The physical sensation was exactly like being hit by a truck at high speed. My chest contracted in painful spasms that made breathing difficult. My stomach churned in nauseating waves that made me seriously consider the possibility of vomiting right there on the kitchen floor, and especially my conscious mind seemed incapable of accepting the reality of the unequivocal visual evidence that was documented in the bright social media photographs. During the following 15 minutes that seemed to last several interminable hours, I managed to gather enough courage to methodically examine every detail of the posts Regina had shared publicly, probably without considering that I would have access to that evidence, or without caring sufficiently about the emotional consequences her actions would have on me. The photographs were organized chronologically, beginning with images from the airport where they appeared carrying expensive luggage I had never seen before, progressing through various famous tourist spots anyone would instantly recognize, and culminating with romantic selfies in elegant restaurants where they toasted with wines that cost more than I spent on groceries during an entire month. What disturbed me most wasn't just the fact that Regina had lied about having cancer, but the sophistication and premeditation of the fraud she had orchestrated with Mauricio's active help. They had clearly planned the entire farce for weeks or perhaps months, creating a convincing false medical narrative that included specific symptoms described dramatically, names of fictitious doctors who supposedly had made alarming diagnoses, and especially an artificial temporal urgency that prevented me from independently verifying the truthfulness of the information through personal medical follow-up. Regina had meticulously studied my personality during decades of family coexistence, knowing exactly which emotional triggers could motivate me to transfer significant amounts of money without asking detailed technical questions or demanding official medical documentation that proved the real need for the alleged treatments. I picked up my phone with hands that trembled like leaves in the wind during storms, and dialed Regina's number that I had memorized since childhood, desperately hoping she could provide some rational explanation that would transform that apparently criminal situation into some kind of complex but innocent misunderstanding that could be resolved through frank conversation between mother and daughter. After 5 long rings that echoed like amplified heartbeats in my anxious ears, Regina finally answered with a cheerful and relaxed voice that contrasted dramatically with the tone of physical suffering she had used during our previous conversations about her supposed serious medical condition. "Dear daughter, how good to hear your voice. How are you doing?" she said with theatrical naturalness that clearly revealed she had completely forgotten the elaborate lies she had told about recovering from complex oncological surgery, or simply no longer cared about maintaining the farce now that she had obtained the desired money. Her voice had that relaxed quality of someone who was enjoying expensive vacation without any financial worry or emotional stress, a vocal tonality that instantly confirmed I had been a victim of calculated psychological manipulation, instead of genuinely helping a sick mother who needed support during a difficult medical period. "Mom, I'm seeing your photographs from the European trip you posted on social media. Could you explain to me how it's possible to be enjoying luxurious vacation in Italy 3 weeks after an oncological surgery that supposedly required absolute rest for 2 months?" I asked directly, trying to keep my voice controlled despite the emotional storm devastating my interior. My strategy was to give her an opportunity to confess voluntarily and provide honest explanations before fully expressing my indignation about the fraud that had been committed against me. The embarrassing silence that followed my direct question lasted long enough for me to hear background sounds that confirmed her international location, voices speaking foreign languages, ambient music typical of elegant European restaurants, and especially the characteristic sound of Mauricio laughing loudly in the background, apparently unconscious or indifferent to the fact that Regina was being confronted about the crimes they had committed together. When she finally broke the tense silence, her voice had completely lost its initial artificial joy and assumed a defensive tone that revealed she knew exactly why I was calling and had been expecting that conversation for weeks. "Letitia, you're exaggerating the situation. I deserved a vacation after so much stress. And besides, you owe me this for what I did for you during all these years as a dedicated mother," Regina responded, instantly revealing her true opinion about our family relationship, and especially about her distorted perception that having been a mother gave her perpetual right to financially exploit her daughter through any available method, including elaborate medical frauds that caused months of unnecessary psychological suffering. Regina's response echoed in my ear like an emotional death sentence that instantly confirmed all my most terrible and unwanted suspicions about the true nature of the relationship I had always believed was based on unconditional maternal love and absolute family protection. Her words carried that defensive and arrogant quality of someone who had been caught red-handed committing a heinous crime, but still tried to justify her actions through twisted logic that transformed victims into debtors and criminals into moral creditors of eternal gratitude for past services that supposedly created perpetual debts never completely paid off. "You owe me this for what I did for you during all these years as a dedicated mother." I repeated her words slowly, feeling each syllable burn my throat like corrosive acid, while trying to process the magnitude of the moral distortion that allowed Regina to equate decades of biologically obligatory motherhood with the right to commit elaborate medical frauds that had caused months of unnecessary psychological suffering and calculated financial devastation. "Do you really believe that being my mother gives you the perpetual right to rob me using lies about terminal cancer, transforming my genuine filial love into a tool for financial manipulation?" The embarrassing silence that followed my rhetorical question lasted approximately 12 seconds that I counted mentally while hearing in the background of the international call the characteristic sounds of an elegant European restaurant: silver cutlery touching fine porcelain, animated conversations in fluent Italian, sophisticated ambient music that contrasted dramatically with the emotional horror I was experiencing from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. When Regina finally broke the tense silence, her voice had completely abandoned any pretense of regret or guilt, revealing a calculating coldness that made me question whether I had really known my own mother during 37 years of family coexistence. "Letitia, you've always been very dramatic since childhood, transforming normal situations into Shakespearean tragedies that exist only in your hyperactive imagination," she said with a condescending tone that used decades of maternal knowledge about my psychological insecurities to try to make me question my own sanity and perception of objective reality. I was really sick with worrying symptoms that doctors investigated extensively before clearing me to travel. If I decided to take advantage of the opportunity to make a trip I always dreamed of after receiving medical clearance, that demonstrates my admirable psychological resilience. Not any kind of fraud, as you're insinuating in such an offensive and unfair way. The absolute audacity of her shameless lies left me momentarily speechless, as if my brain was refusing to accept that someone could be so shamelessly dishonest while confronted with unequivocal photographic evidence of her criminal actions. "Regina, I'm literally looking at photographs of you and Mauricio posing happily at famous tourist spots, wearing very expensive clothes you never owned before my bank transfer, displaying designer jewelry that costs more than my monthly salary, and you still have the audacity to tell me this is my imagination?" I asked, feeling my voice progressively rise in volume as indignation temporarily overcame the emotional shock that had initially paralyzed me. "Mauricio gave me these clothes and jewelry because he truly loves me and wants to see me happy, something my own daughter apparently can't do without constantly complaining about money as if I were a stranger begging on the street," Regina responded, deliberately introducing Mauricio into the conversation as supposed proof that she was loved and valued by someone, trying to make me feel guilty for questioning financial decisions that had resulted in the transfer of $25,000 I had meticulously saved over years of hard work and careful financial planning. The mention of Mauricio as generous benefactor instead of opportunistic scammer instantly activated my memory about all the strange and suspicious interactions I had observed during the 6 months since he had mysteriously appeared in Regina's life, with vague stories about international business success and lucrative investments he could never explain in detail when questioned about technical specifics. "Mom, are you telling me that Mauricio, a man you met only 6 months ago, and who apparently was so desperately broke that you needed to invent a cancer story to get urgent money, suddenly has financial resources to buy very expensive jewelry and pay for luxurious trips through Europe?" I asked, using basic logic to expose the glaring inconsistencies in the fraudulent narrative she was trying to construct. "Mauricio finally received a delayed payment from old investments that were bureaucratically blocked, so we were able to take this trip we planned for months as a celebration of our loving union," Regina explained quickly, fabricating a new layer of lies to cover the inconsistencies of the previous story, demonstrating that characteristic ability of compulsive liars to create elaborate narratives instantly to justify obviously suspicious behaviors. "If you really cared about my maternal happiness instead of being obsessed with petty financial issues, you would be genuinely happy to know I finally found a man who values me and treats me like the queen I always deserved to be treated." I hung up the phone abruptly in the middle of her manipulative response, unable to continue hearing increasingly elaborate lies that insulted my intelligence and especially transformed my legitimate indignation about financial fraud into supposed moral defect of jealous and petty daughter. My fingers trembled violently as I held the cell phone that had become hot from the prolonged international call time, and my breathing emerged in irregular gasps that revealed the beginning of a panic attack, provoked by the emotional overload of simultaneously confronting maternal betrayal, calculated psychological manipulation, and especially the complete destruction of everything I believed I knew about family honesty and parental loyalty. I desperately needed to talk with someone who could validate my perception of reality and assure me I wasn't really being dramatic or irrational, as Regina had so convincingly suggested using her intimate knowledge about my psychological insecurities developed during decades of maternal conditioning. Patricia, my best friend since business administration college days and now a corporate lawyer specializing in business law and complex commercial contracts, would be the perfect person to provide objective perspective and especially guidance about possible legal actions against a mother who had committed what appeared to be elaborate medical fraud, combined with misappropriation of financial resources obtained through calculated emotional manipulation. I dialed Patricia's number with hands that still trembled uncontrollably, and she answered after only 2 rings with her characteristically cheerful and energetic voice that contrasted dramatically with my devastated emotional state. "Dear Leticia, what a wonderful surprise to receive your call on a rainy Monday. How are you doing?" she asked with genuine enthusiasm that made me instantly break down in uncontrollable convulsive crying I had been repressing throughout the tense conversation with Regina. During the following 15 minutes, I related to Patricia the entire traumatic situation from the false cancer diagnosis 3 months ago to the discovery of the luxurious European photographs that devastating morning, including every detail I could remember about Regina's elaborate lies, the desperate requests for money for urgent medical treatments that supposedly couldn't wait for bureaucratic health insurance approvals, and especially the horrifying phone conversation where my own mother had tried to justify medical fraud through twisted arguments about perpetual filial debts based on obligatory biological motherhood. Leticia, breathe deeply with me now, because I need you to understand something absolutely critical about this situation, Patricia said with that controlled professional voice she used when she needed to communicate serious legal information to clients in emotionally charged situations. What your mother did wasn't just morally reprehensible or emotionally manipulative. It was possibly a federal crime of aggravated fraud, characterized by the use of deception to obtain illicit financial advantage through lies about material facts that motivated the transfer of significant resources. Patricia's words floated in the air like judicial sentences that transformed my personal family tragedy into a potential criminal case that could result in formal legal proceedings against my own biological mother. The idea of criminally reporting Regina caused me immediate physical nausea, not because I doubted the seriousness of her actions, but because 3 decades of cultural conditioning about unconditional family loyalty created powerful psychological barriers against any action that could result in severe legal consequences for nuclear family members. Patricia, I don't know if I can do this. Criminally reporting my own mother seems to cross a fundamental moral line that shouldn't be crossed regardless of circumstances, I confessed, revealing the internal ethical conflicts that paralyzed me emotionally, despite clear evidence of deliberate criminal behavior. She's my mother, the woman who gave birth to me, who took care of me when I was sick during childhood, who supported me during difficult adolescent moments. How can I simply ignore all our shared history because of an error of judgment motivated by emotional desperation? Leticia, listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you now because this could save your future financial and emotional life. Patricia responded with urgency that conveyed genuine concern mixed with professional frustration about my reluctance to protect my own legal rights. Your mother didn't commit an error of judgment motivated by desperation. She executed an elaborate fraudulent scheme over 3 months that involved inventing a false medical diagnosis, fabricating non-existent surgical urgency, systematic psychological manipulation using your filial love as a weapon against you, and appropriation of $25,000 you saved through years of honest work. Every word Patricia pronounced was technically correct, but emotionally devastating, because it forced me to confront objective legal realities about maternal behavior. I was still desperately trying to justify through psychological explanations that preserved some version of the loving mother I believed I had known during decades of relatively harmonious family coexistence. But what if she really believed Mauricio urgently needed the money and was genuinely trying to help the man she loves, even if through questionable methods? I argued weakly, trying to find alternative narratives that allowed interpreting Regina's actions as well-intentioned despite being technically illegal. Then she consciously chose to protect a man she's known for 6 months instead of protecting the daughter she raised for 37 years, and made that choice knowing perfectly well she was lying about having cancer and causing you extreme psychological suffering unnecessarily. Patricia argued with implacable logic that left no room for romantic interpretations about maternal motivations. Leticia, you need to understand that true love never asks for sacrifices that fundamentally harm us. If Regina genuinely loved you as a mother should love her daughter, she would never have invented a false terminal illness to manipulate your emotions and extract significant financial resources from your bank account. Patricia's words pierced through the psychological defenses I had instinctively built to protect my internalized image of Regina as a loving mother who occasionally made errors of judgment under emotional pressure. Instead of accepting the objective reality that she had become a calculating criminal, willing to exploit family relationships for personal financial benefit, the emotional resistance I felt about taking legal action against my own mother gradually began to dissolve as Patricia systematically dismantled each justification I tried to construct to minimize or excuse Regina's flagrantly fraudulent behavior. I need to investigate more before making any definitive decision about legal actions, I finally said, committing myself to at least explore the complete extent of the betrayal before deciding on formal criminal charges. I'm going to hire a private investigator to discover more about Mauricio, and especially to verify if there are other victims he exploited using similar schemes involving false romantic relationships with vulnerable women. Patricia agreed that additional investigation would be prudent before filing formal criminal charges, and provided me with contact information for Fernando, her cousin who worked as a private investigator specializing in financial fraud cases and romantic scams that exploited emotionally needy people through strategically fabricated affective relationships. Fernando has extensive experience documenting behavior patterns of professional scammers who specialize in seducing mature women with financial resources, generally widows or divorced lonely women who long for companionship and are particularly vulnerable to charming men who demonstrate initially genuine romantic interest before gradually introducing progressively larger financial requests. Patricia explained, perfectly describing the pattern that seemed to characterize the relationship between Regina and Mauricio. I called Fernando immediately after ending the conversation with Patricia, anxious to hire his investigative services before Regina and Mauricio could return from Europe and potentially destroy evidence or fabricate additional stories to cover their fraudulent activities. Fernando answered with a deep professional voice that inspired immediate confidence through its controlled tonality and precise technical vocabulary that demonstrated substantial experience investigating complex financial crimes involving sophisticated psychological manipulation. Ms. Leticia, Patricia briefed me preliminarily about your situation during a quick message she sent while you were talking, so I already have basic understanding about the main elements of the case, Fernando began, eliminating the need for long explanations I would have emotional difficulty articulating again. Based on preliminary information, it seems to me we're potentially dealing with a professional scammer who systematically operates in multiple jurisdictions exploiting women through strategically fabricated romantic relationships to create emotional dependence that facilitates progressively larger financial requests. Fernando's technical description of the typical psychological profile of romantic scammers corresponded perfectly to Mauricio's observed behavior during the 6 months since he had mysteriously appeared in Regina's life with vague stories about international business success that never materialized into concrete financial resources or independently verifiable investments. My first step will be to investigate Mauricio's criminal background in national and state databases, checking if there are records of previous fraudulent activities, civil lawsuits related to unpaid debts or breached contracts, and especially looking for patterns of short relationships with women that ended when financial resources were completely exhausted, Fernando explained, describing systematic investigative methodology that would reveal the complete profile of the alleged criminal. I'll also discreetly monitor Regina and Mauricio's social media to chronologically document their posts during the European trip, creating a detailed timeline that correlates specific posting dates with estimated expenses based on geographic location, types of hotels, frequented restaurants, and tourist activities performed, Fernando continued, demonstrating sophisticated understanding about how contemporary digital evidence could support potential criminal accusations in future judicial proceedings. This visual documentation will be crucial if you eventually decide to file formal criminal charges. because it will unequivocally demonstrate your mother was traveling luxuriously during a period when she supposedly should be recovering from complex oncological surgery requiring prolonged absolute medical rest. During the following 2 weeks that dragged with torturous slowness of an interminable nightmare, Fernando methodically worked investigating all aspects of Mauricio's life that could be accessed through public records, government databases, and especially through discreet monitoring of his social media activities and indirect financial movements that left digital trails exploitable by experienced investigators. The discoveries he gradually compiled during this period confirmed my worst suspicions about Mauricio's true nature, and especially revealed that Regina wasn't his first victim, but simply the most recent in a long series of mature women who had been systematically exploited through the same basic scheme repeated with minor variations adapted to each individual victim's specific vulnerabilities. Leticia, I need to share with you the preliminary investigation results because they're significantly more serious than any of us could have initially anticipated, Fernando said during our face-to-face meeting in a discreet coffee shop located in the commercial center. Surrounded by corporate professionals who chatted animatedly about business, while we silently discussed evidence of devastating financial crimes. He opened a thick brown leather folder filled with printed documents, colored photographs, and especially detailed reports that meticulously documented every aspect of Mauricio's criminal life during the last 15 years. Mauricio Henrique Costa Silva, his full name which he frequently abbreviates to seem more sophisticated and international, has extensive criminal background in at least 3 different states, involving multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, document falsification, and especially formation of a gang specialized in romantic scams directed specifically against divorced or widowed women between 50 and 70 years of age, Fernando reported, consulting his meticulous notes while I tried to mentally process the magnitude of the criminal operation in which Regina had become involuntarily complicit through her emotional vulnerability and psychological loneliness. The photographs Fernando spread over the coffee shop table showed Mauricio with at least 5 different women during the last 10 years, all apparently in age ranges similar to Regina, all displaying that characteristic expression of newly discovered romantic happiness that lonely people demonstrate when they believe they've finally found genuine companionship after years of forced solitude. Each of these women reported to police authorities having transferred significant amounts to Mauricio, ranging between $10,000 and $40,000, always under pretext of urgent medical emergencies, unmissable investment opportunities requiring immediate capital, or debts to dangerous loan sharks who threatened physical violence if not quickly paid, Fernando explained, describing a consistent pattern of psychological manipulation that Mauricio had perfected through years of criminal practice. In at least 2 documented cases, Mauricio convinced his victims to commit document frauds, similar to what your mother did with you, using adult daughters' identities to contract large bank loans that were never paid, resulting in complete destruction of those innocent daughters' financial credit who needed to battle for years in courts to clear their names and cancel fraudulent debts. Fernando continued, revealing that my situation wasn't either unique or particularly sophisticated, but simply the most recent iteration of a well-established criminal scheme Mauricio had repeatedly executed with substantial success. The information provided by Fernando completely transformed my understanding of the family situation I was facing. Regina wasn't simply a mother who had made an error of judgment under temporary emotional pressure, but a victim of a professional criminal who had been deliberately selected as a vulnerable target and systematically manipulated during months of calculated psychological conditioning that exploited her emotional loneliness and desperate desire for romantic companionship in old age. Fernando, are you telling me Mauricio is essentially a financial predator who specializes in identifying emotionally vulnerable women and transforming them into tools for his criminal schemes? I asked, trying to synthesize the complex information into clear understanding about the fundamental nature of the criminal operation. Exactly, and more specifically, Mauricio demonstrates a consistent pattern of selecting women who have financially successful adult daughters with impeccable credit reputation that can be exploited to contract large loans, Fernando confirmed, exposing the additional layer of strategic premeditation that made Mauricio's crimes particularly pernicious. He doesn't choose his victims randomly through casual encounters as he pretended to have done with Regina. He methodically identifies them through social media searches, dating website profiles, and especially through observation in locations frequented by lonely mature women like church groups, book clubs, dance classes, or specialized gyms. The revelation that Regina had been deliberately selected as a vulnerable target instead of simply having had bad luck of meeting a criminal by coincidence added an additional dimension of calculated manipulation that made the situation even more emotionally disturbing. Based on my investigations about the relationship history between Regina and Mauricio, I can clearly identify the typical phases of a professional romantic scam, beginning with an initial 2-month period of intense courtship where he demonstrated constant romantic attention without making any financial requests, establishing a foundation of emotional trust and psychological dependence, Fernando explained, describing systematized predatory methodology that transformed romantic conquest into applied science of financial exploitation. Then came the phase of gradual introduction of apparently temporary financial problems, starting with small loans of a few $100s that he always paid quickly to demonstrate trustworthiness and honesty, progressing to larger amounts in the thousands that he justified through stories about imminent investment opportunities or minor medical emergencies, and finally culminating in the creation of a fabricated financial crisis involving dangerous loan sharks who supposedly threatened physical violence if debts weren't urgently paid, Fernando continued, precisely mapping the psychological progression that had transformed Regina from an independent woman into an involuntary accomplice to crimes against her own daughter. I left the meeting with Fernando carrying the thick folder filled with documentary evidence about Mauricio's systematic crimes, feeling simultaneously validation from the confirmation that my suspicions were justified, and absolute horror at the magnitude of the criminal operation in which my mother had been ensnared through her emotional vulnerability. The photographs of Mauricio's previous victims particularly haunted me because they revealed a visible pattern of women who shared similar physical and demographic characteristics, all in the range of 50 to 65 years old, all appearing financially solid through well-maintained clothes and discreet jewelry, and especially all displaying that particular facial expression of people who had gone through significant emotional losses and desperately longed for genuine human connection that made them exceptionally vulnerable to charming manipulators. The decision to confront Regina again, this time armed with irrefutable evidence about Mauricio's true criminal nature, weighed on me like a complicated moral responsibility because I knew it would completely destroy the romantic illusions she had built about a relationship that probably represented her last perceived opportunity for conjugal happiness in old age. But I also understood that allowing Regina to continue being exploited by a professional criminal would be equivalent to passive complicity in future crimes he would inevitably commit, using the same manipulative methods against other equally vulnerable victims. 2 weeks after receiving Fernando's detailed investigative report, Regina and Mauricio finally returned from the luxurious European trip, and I scheduled a face-to-face meeting with both in a neutral public cafe where abundant witnesses would prevent any attempt at physical intimidation or excessive emotional manipulation during the final confrontation about the criminal evidence I had meticulously compiled. The choice of public location for the meeting was strategic, and based on Patricia's recommendations about how to conduct confrontations with potential criminals, who might react defensively or even aggressively when exposed to their systematized fraudulent activities. When Regina and Mauricio entered the cafe that sunny Thursday afternoon, I immediately noticed subtle changes in both their body language that revealed growing awareness that the situation was rapidly deteriorating to an unsustainable position where elaborate lies could no longer be convincingly maintained in the face of growing objective evidence. Regina avoided direct eye contact with me, obsessively focusing on adjusting her new designer purse and smoothing the expensive dress she clearly had bought during the European trip with my money, while Mauricio maintained that confident, calculating expression of someone accustomed to manipulating difficult situations through superficial charm and convincing emotional narratives. Mom, Mauricio, thank you for agreeing to meet with me personally to discuss the situation that needs to be urgently resolved before escalating to irreversible legal consequences. I began diplomatically, establishing a serious but not immediately accusatory tone that would allow me to observe their initial reactions before presenting more devastating evidence. I placed on the cafe table the brown leather folder provided by Fernando, leaving it closed momentarily to create psychological tension while I evaluated facial micro-expressions that could reveal guilt, fear, or especially conscious premeditation about crimes that had been deliberately committed. Dear Letitia, before we start any unpleasant conversation, I need you to understand that your exaggerated reaction about our trip is causing terrible emotional stress for your mother, who just wanted to take advantage of an opportunity to visit places she always dreamed of seeing. Mauricio immediately intervened, trying to control the narrative from the beginning of the conversation, and position me as a problematic daughter causing unnecessary family drama for petty reasons related to jealousy about maternal happiness recently found. I completely ignored Mauricio's attempt to divert attention from central issues through emotional manipulation and calmly opened the investigative folder, methodically spreading over the table photographs of 5 previous victims Fernando had documented, official criminal records showing multiple convictions for fraud and various scams, and especially witness testimonies from daughters who had been financially harmed by schemes identical to what had been executed against me. Mauricio Henrique Costa Silva, I would like you to explain to my mother who these women in the photographs are, and especially why there are criminal proceedings in 3 different states accusing you of financial crimes practically identical to what you orchestrated against our family during the last 6 months. The silence that installed itself over our table in the cafe after my direct and incisive question lasted approximately 23 seconds timed mentally, during which I could observe with cinematographic clarity the facial micro-expressions that progressively revealed the disintegration of the carefully constructed social masks Mauricio and Regina had maintained during months of fraudulent operation. Mauricio was the first to recover superficial composure, his calculating dark eyes quickly scanning the photographs and documents spread over the table, while his brain worked frantically to fabricate plausible explanations that could minimize or contextualize the devastating evidence I had so methodically presented. Leticia, these old photographs are clearly misunderstandings from past relationships that ended amicably. And as for the supposed criminal proceedings, they're false accusations made by vindictive women who couldn't accept relationship endings in a mature and adult way. Mauricio finally responded with that artificially controlled voice trying to convey innocent indignation in the face of unjust accusations, but which sounded progressively less convincing as he perceived from my impassive facial expression that I wasn't receptive to hastily fabricated narratives. You hired private investigators to invade my privacy and build a false dossier about me, transforming normal life situations into imaginary criminal conspiracy that exists only in your paranoid head. Mauricio's attempt to invert the accusatory dynamic, transforming me into an irrational persecutor and himself into a misunderstood victim of invasive investigation, demonstrated exactly the manipulative strategy Fernando had described during our briefing about typical psychological profiles of professional scammers. When confronted with irrefutable evidence, they invariably attack the credibility of information sources instead of substantively responding to specific accusations presented. Mauricio, these aren't supposed criminal proceedings. They're definitive judicial sentences where you were criminally convicted of aggravated fraud in 3 different states, serving alternative sentences that included specific legal restrictions prohibiting you from establishing romantic relationships with women over 50 years of age without prior disclosure of your criminal background. I responded calmly, picking up a specific document from the folder and pointing to official stamps and judicial signatures that proved absolute authenticity of the information. Regina, who had remained silent since the beginning of the confrontation, observing alternately the photographs spread over the table and Mauricio's progressively more tense face, finally broke her embarrassed mutism with a trembling voice that revealed growing awareness she had been systematically deceived by someone in whom she had placed absolute emotional trust and desperate romantic hopes. Mauricio, who are these women in these photographs? Why are you romantically embracing them the same way you pose with me in our photos together? She asked, picking up one of the photographs with trembling fingers and bringing it close to her face to examine in detail every aspect of the image that documented a previous relationship visibly similar to theirs. Regina's direct question directed specifically to Mauricio, instead of continuing to attack me defensively as she had done during our international phone conversation, signaled a fundamental change in her perception of the situation. She was finally beginning to consider the possibility that perhaps she had been manipulated by someone significantly more dangerous and calculating than she ever imagined when she allowed that mysterious man to enter her life 6 months earlier with romantic promises and vague stories about international business success. Regina, love, these are just old photographs from relationships that ended years ago. They have no relevance to what we built together based on true love and genuine commitment. Mauricio tried to reassure her, extending his hand to touch her arm in a gesture of physical reassurance that was subtly rejected when Regina instinctively moved her body away from him. Mom, I need you to read specifically this testimony here, provided by Helena Cristina Alves, a 60-year-old woman who met Mauricio exactly the same way you did, through an apparently casual encounter at a dance group for mature adults, I said, carefully selecting a specific document from the investigative folder and placing it directly in Regina's hands. physically forcing her to confront objective realities, instead of allowing her to continue taking refuge in comfortable psychological denial. Helena reports that Mauricio courted her intensively for 2 months without making any financial request, establishing a foundation of emotional trust. Then gradually introduced stories about temporary financial problems caused by bureaucratically blocked investments, and finally convinced her to transfer $36,000 to pay urgent debts to loan sharks who supposedly threatened physical violence. Regina began reading the testimony with eyes that progressively widened as she recognized narrative patterns identical to those she herself had experienced during her relationship with Mauricio. The same initial intense courtship tactics, the same stories about bureaucratic blocks in lucrative investments, the same fabricated financial emergencies involving threatening loan sharks, and especially the same promises of quick repayment that never materialized into concrete bank transfers. Mauricio, this describes exactly what happened between us. You said the same things, used the same excuses, made the same promises, Regina murmured, her voice becoming progressively weaker as the magnitude of the psychological manipulation to which she had been subjected began to penetrate through the emotional defenses she had built to protect her romantic illusions about a relationship that apparently represented her last chance for conjugal happiness in old age. Helena also reports in the testimony that Mauricio convinced her to use her adult daughter's documents to contract large bank loans, exactly as you did with me, resulting in complete destruction of the innocent daughter's financial credit, who needed to battle for 3 years in courts to clear her name and cancel fraudulent debts. I continued, establishing an unequivocal parallel between Helena's situation and our own family tragedy. Helena's daughter developed severe depression during that period, lost important professional opportunities because of the ruined credit reputation, and especially completely broke off the relationship with the mother, who had betrayed her trust so devastatingly through financial crimes motivated by romantic manipulation of a professional criminal. Tears began silently descending Regina's wrinkled cheeks as she continued reading the detailed testimony that meticulously documented each phase of the fraudulent operation executed by Mauricio against Helena and her family, recognizing with painful clarity that she wasn't a victim of unique circumstances or exceptionally unfortunate relationship, but simply one more iteration in a systematic criminal pattern Mauricio had perfected through years of predatory practice against emotionally vulnerable women. He told me he loved me, that I was the most special woman he had ever met, that he had finally found the ideal companion to spend the rest of his life together, Regina said with a voice broken by the devastating reality of discovering that all the romantic love she believed she had finally conquered, after years of post-divorce loneliness, was simply a calculated theatrical performance executed by an experienced criminal. Mauricio says exactly the same things to all his victims. It's a rehearsed script he repeats with minimal variations adapted to each woman's specific vulnerabilities. He methodically selects as a target, I explained, trying to help Regina understand the systematized nature of the manipulation to which she had been subjected. He didn't choose you for love or genuine attraction. He identified you as a vulnerable target through observation in places you frequent, researched your financial situation through social media, where you proudly mentioned my professional success as a business consultant, and especially calculated that your emotional loneliness after difficult divorce 5 years ago would make you particularly receptive to intense romantic attention from an apparently successful and charming man. Mauricio, perceiving the situation was irreversibly deteriorating as Regina began accepting objective realities about the fraudulent nature of their relationship, completely abandoned his innocent denial strategy and adopted an aggressively defensive posture that revealed more sinister aspects of his manipulative personality. You two are crazy paranoids building conspiracy fantasies from normal life coincidences. Regina, are you really going to believe this ungrateful daughter who persecutes you with private investigators instead of trusting the man who genuinely loves you and treated you like a queen for 6 wonderful months? He said, attempting a last desperate maneuver to create division between mother and daughter through emotional appeals about romantic loyalty versus supposed family conspiracies. Mauricio, I saw you posing exactly the same way with 5 different women in these photographs, wearing the same elegant clothes, making the same romantic gestures, even choosing the same tourist locations for luxurious trips paid with money stolen from these naive women. Regina responded with growing firmness that revealed psychological transformation happening in real time as she processed objective evidence and especially recognized behavioral patterns she had deliberately ignored for months out of fear of losing a relationship that represented desperately needed emotional validation. All these women are approximately my age. All appear to have stable financial resources. All demonstrate in the photographs that expression of happiness I myself felt when I believed I had finally found true love in old age. Regina, don't let this manipulative daughter destroy what we built together based on true love. She's simply jealous of your happiness and wants to keep you alone and miserable for the rest of your life. Mauricio desperately tried, perceiving he was losing control over the situation, and especially over Regina, who represented not only a source of financial resources, but also a possible witness who could provide devastating evidence in future criminal proceedings. His voice had completely lost its initial seductive charm and assumed an urgent, almost threatening tone that revealed growing panic about legal consequences he would inevitably face if Regina decided to cooperate with authorities instead of continuing to protect him through misdirected romantic loyalty. Mauricio, I'm no longer the naive woman you met 6 months ago. These evidences are irrefutable and especially demonstrate you're a financial predator who systematically exploits vulnerable women through fabricated romantic relationships. Regina declared with surprising determination, considering that minutes before she was still defensively protecting Mauricio against my accusations. I need to know exactly how many lies you told me, how many stories you invented, how many manipulations you executed to transform me into a criminal against my own daughter. Regina's psychological transformation from defensive accomplice to conscious victim happened with notable speed as she emotionally processed the devastating implications of the revelations about the true nature of the man she believed she genuinely loved. Mauricio abruptly stood up from the chair with a brusque movement that made several people in the cafe turn to observe our table, clearly calculating whether he should continue trying to manipulate the situation or simply abandon the confrontation that was rapidly deteriorating to an unsustainable position. You two deserve each other. Crazy mother and paranoid daughter living in conspiracy fantasies instead of appreciating true love when it appears in your pathetic lives, he said with a voice loaded with venom that finally revealed his true opinion about women he had manipulated for years, completely abandoning the mask of charming gentleman and exposing the predatory nature he kept hidden behind calculated smiles and rehearsed romantic declarations. Mauricio, before you leave here, I need to inform you that I've already filed formal criminal charges against you at the Specialized Financial Crimes Police Station, providing all this documentary evidence about your systematic fraudulent activities, I said calmly, removing from the investigative folder a copy of the police report I had strategically filed even before scheduling that confrontational meeting. The police are actively investigating your crimes and will probably issue a preventive arrest warrant within 72 hours. So any attempt to flee the jurisdiction will be interpreted as implicit confession and will result in intensification of searches through national and international wanted person systems. The revelation about criminal charges already filed transformed Mauricio's facial expression from defensive arrogance to genuine panic, as he quickly understood the situation had escalated far beyond a simple family confrontation that could be manipulated through charm or psychological intimidation. You're going to regret this when my lawyers sue you for defamation, slander, and especially for unjustified persecution based on evidence fabricated by incompetent investigators. He threatened weakly, but was already physically backing toward the cafe exit, clearly evaluating escape options before police authorities could locate him and execute the imminent arrest warrant. My lawyers are already prepared for any legal action you try to initiate, and especially are ready to add new charges of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice if you try to contact Regina or any other witness involved in the criminal investigations. I responded firmly, demonstrating I had meticulously prepared for all possible defensive or offensive reactions Mauricio might try to execute. Fernando, the private investigator who compiled all this evidence, is documenting this confrontation through discrete audio recording, so any additional threat you make will be added to the criminal dossier that's progressively growing against you. Mauricio abruptly left the cafe without saying anything more, leaving Regina and me sitting in tense silence, surrounded by the documentary evidence spread over the table that revealed the complete magnitude of the criminal operation in which she had been ensnared through emotional vulnerabilities, systematically exploited by an experienced financial predator. People at adjacent tables observed our situation with poorly disguised curiosity, clearly perceiving they had witnessed a significant dramatic confrontation, but without fully understanding the complex criminal context that had motivated that tense encounter. Leticia, I don't even know how to begin asking forgiveness for what I did to you. I transformed my own daughter into a victim of financial crimes because I was desperate for love and companionship after years of loneliness that made me accept attention from any man who demonstrated romantic interest," Regina finally said. Her voice choked with sobs that revealed the depth of emotional regret she was experiencing, as she understood the complete magnitude of the betrayal she had committed against a maternal relationship that should represent unconditional protection, instead of a source of deliberate harm. "Mom, I need you to understand that although I recognize you were manipulated by a professional criminal, that doesn't completely eliminate your responsibility for the conscious choices you made during 3 months of elaborate medical fraud," I responded, establishing clear emotional boundaries that would prevent premature transformation of Regina from repentant criminal to completely exonerated victim. "You chose to invent a false cancer diagnosis, fabricate non-existent surgical urgency, and especially exploit my filial love as a tool for financial manipulation to get $25,000 you voluntarily transferred to Mauricio's bank account without independently verifying the truthfulness of the stories he told about threatening loan sharks." Regina accepted my critical assessment without trying to defend herself through emotional justifications, demonstrating she was finally beginning to assume real responsibility for actions she had consciously executed, even while being partially motivated by external psychological manipulation. "I know I deserve to completely lose your trust, and that I'll probably never manage to recover the maternal relationship I destroyed through my selfish and criminal choices," she said, explicitly acknowledging permanent relational consequences that would inevitably result from the betrayal she had committed against her own daughter. "I need to know exactly what happened from the moment Mauricio entered your life until now, including every detail about how he convinced you to invent the cancer story, and especially how he taught you to manipulate my emotions so efficiently," I said, preparing myself to hear a complete confession that would be necessary not only for my own emotional closure, but also to provide detailed testimonial evidence that would support criminal proceedings against Mauricio. During the following 2 hours in that cafe that gradually emptied as the afternoon advanced toward evening, Regina meticulously related each phase of her relationship with Mauricio, from the initial, apparently casual encounter at a dance group for mature adults, to the devastating moment when she discovered through my evidence that everything had been a calculated criminal performance. She described how Mauricio had been perfectly attentive during the first 2 months without making any financial request, establishing a solid foundation of emotional trust through small but significant gifts, long conversations about shared dreams and aspirations, and especially constant demonstrations of genuine interest in her life that contrasted dramatically with years of post-divorce loneliness. After I was already completely in love and emotionally dependent on him, Mauricio gradually began mentioning temporary financial problems. First were stories about lucrative investments that were bureaucratically blocked by complex legal issues. Then came narratives about imminent business opportunities requiring modest initial capital. And finally, he introduced the story about debts to dangerous loan sharks who threatened physical violence if not urgently paid, Regina explained, precisely mapping the psychological progression Fernando had described as a typical characteristic of professional romantic scams. "When I suggested he simply borrow money directly from you, Mauricio immediately rejected the idea, claiming masculine pride, and especially saying he didn't want our relationship to begin with him being seen as a financial opportunist by your daughter," Regina continued, revealing the sophistication of the psychological manipulation Mauricio had executed to avoid direct contact with me, where his fabricated stories could be technically questioned. "It was he who suggested I invent a story about serious illness to get money quickly without arousing your suspicions about the true recipient of the resources, and especially it was he who taught me exactly which symptoms to describe, which medical urgencies to fabricate, and how to manipulate your filial emotions to maximize the amount transferred." Regina's detailed confession about Mauricio's conscious involvement in planning the medical fraud provided crucial testimonial evidence that would transform the criminal case from simple fraud to aggravated fraud with demonstrated premeditation, potentially doubling the prison sentence Mauricio would face if convicted in a formal trial. He repeatedly assured me he could pay everything back quickly through investments that would finally be released, and that you would never need to know the money had been used to help him instead of paying non-existent medical treatments, Regina continued, exposing additional layers of manipulation that had allowed her to rationalize criminal behavior as a temporary solution that would be resolved before negative consequences materialized. "When I finally managed to transfer $25,000 from your account, Mauricio immediately began planning the European trip as a deserved reward for the months of stress we had gone through. And I was so relieved to have managed to help him, and so emotionally exhausted from the medical farce I had maintained for 3 months, that I accepted without questioning where he had gotten additional resources to pay for such an expensive trip, Regina confessed, demonstrating how victims of psychological manipulation frequently ignore obvious logical inconsistencies when they're emotionally invested in preserving illusions about relationships that represent desperately needed personal validation. When we finally left that cafe after hours of devastating emotional confrontation, I felt a complex mixture of relief at having finally exposed the complete truth about the criminal operation, profound sadness at the irreversible destruction of a maternal relationship that had been the emotional foundation of my life for 37 years, and especially iron determination to ensure Mauricio faced maximum legal consequences for the systematic crimes he had committed against multiple vulnerable victims during years of predatory activity. Regina walked silently beside me to the parking lot, clearly processing the complete magnitude of the revelations, and especially beginning the long psychological journey of rebuilding a personal identity that had been fragmented by the discovery of having been a disposable tool in a professional criminal scheme instead of a loved partner in a genuine romantic relationship. Letitia, regardless of what happens legally, I want you to know I fully recognize having destroyed any right to be called a mother through the criminal choices I consciously made, Regina said when we reached our cars parked side by side, extending a hesitant hand seeking some kind of final physical connection before we separated indefinitely. I'll spend the rest of my life trying somehow to compensate for the terrible damage I caused, even knowing I'll probably never manage to recover your trust or filial love I destroyed so completely. I accepted her handshake briefly, but didn't allow the embrace she clearly desired, establishing physical and emotional boundaries that would protect my mental sanity during the long psychological recovery process I still needed to face. The 3 days following that devastating cafe confrontation were marked by a paradoxical combination of progressive emotional relief at having finally exposed the entire truth about the criminal operation and growing anxiety about legal consequences that would inevitably result from the formal charges I had filed against Mauricio, and potentially against Regina, depending on my final decision about including her as a criminal accomplice, or treating her exclusively as a cooperative witness who had been manipulated by a professional financial predator. During this liminal period of anguished waiting, I maintained daily contact with Patricia and especially with Dr. Amanda, a lawyer specializing in family financial crimes whom Patricia had introduced specifically to handle the legal and especially emotional complexities of judicially prosecuting members of one's own biological family. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez was an impressive 42-year-old woman with straight black hair, always impeccably styled, dark eyes that simultaneously conveyed human compassion and professional determination, and especially documented experience in similar cases involving financial frauds, perpetrated through manipulation of intimate family relationships. Letitia. Based on the evidence Fernando compiled, and especially on the detailed testimony Regina voluntarily provided during the cafe confrontation, we have an extremely solid case against Mauricio that will almost certainly result in substantial criminal conviction, she explained during our first formal meeting in her elegant office located in a corporate skyscraper in the city's financial district. The more delicate question is deciding how to legally proceed in relation to your mother, considering she was simultaneously a victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation and conscious perpetrator of elaborate medical fraud against you. The moral duality of Regina's situation, being both victim and criminal depending on the analytical perspective adopted, created a complex ethical dilemma that had no simple or completely satisfactory resolutions for any of the involved parties. My professional recommendation is to offer a testimonial cooperation agreement for Regina, where she provides detailed evidence against Mauricio in exchange for partial criminal immunity, avoiding formal prosecution against her, but establishing a permanent restraining order, and especially a financial restitution agreement, where she legally commits to return the $25,000 through monthly payments over an extended period, Dr. Amanda suggested, presenting an intermediate solution that balanced legal justice with recognition of extenuating circumstances that had motivated Regina's criminal behavior. The proposed testimonial agreement offered a pragmatic path that would punish Regina through significant financial consequences and permanent relational restrictions without completely destroying her life through formal criminal prosecution that would inevitably result in permanent record as a convicted criminal, substantially hindering her future possibilities for employment, housing, and especially rebuilding personal identity after the devastating experience of having been manipulated by a professional predator. I need to think carefully about this decision, because it will establish a precedent about how to deal with family betrayals in the future, and especially will send a clear message about my fundamental values in relation to personal responsibility versus extenuating circumstances. I responded, requesting a few additional days to emotionally process the implications of each available legal option. During this period of intense moral deliberation, I consulted extensively with Patricia, Fernando, and especially with Dr. Henrique, a renowned oncologist Patricia had introduced to provide professional medical perspective on the ethical seriousness of falsifying a cancer diagnosis, a disease that affects millions of Brazilian families annually and represents one of the most traumatic experiences humans can face. Leticia, as an oncologist who treats cancer patients daily, I can categorically state that inventing a false diagnosis of this specific disease is a particularly pernicious ethical violation because it trivializes the genuine suffering of millions of real patients and their families. Dr. Enrique told me with professional seriousness that emphasized the moral gravity of what Regina had consciously done. Every day I receive families devastated by real cancer diagnoses, people who would give anything for the disease to be just a farce that could be undone through simple confession. Your mother exploited this deepest universal fear for financial manipulation, demonstrating fundamental disrespect for genuine human suffering. Dr. Henrique's words crystallized my final decision about how to legally proceed in relation to Regina. Although I recognized she had been manipulated by Mauricio, I also understood her conscious actions of inventing false cancer, and systematically exploiting my filial love for 3 months constituted a serious ethical violation that deserved significant consequences beyond simply financial restitution. Dr. Amanda, I want to proceed with the testimonial cooperation agreement, but including additional specific conditions. Regina needs to do mandatory community work at an oncological hospital for 2 years to genuinely understand the emotional impact of the disease she falsified, and especially needs to participate in specialized psychological therapy to understand how she became vulnerable to manipulation and develop resistance against future predators. I declared, establishing terms that balanced appropriate punishment with opportunity for genuine personal growth. The legal process against Mauricio progressed with notable efficiency during the following 6 weeks. Driven mainly by the substantial volume of documentary evidence Fernando had meticulously compiled and detailed testimonies provided by Regina and 2 other previous victims Fernando had located and convinced to formally participate in criminal investigations. The public prosecutor's office demonstrated particular interest in the case because it presented an opportunity to establish legal precedent about romantic scams directed against mature women, a crime category that was dramatically increasing as more people used digital technologies and social media to establish relationships, but also became vulnerable to experienced manipulators in exploiting emotional loneliness through online platforms. Mauricio's criminal trial was scheduled for a cold Tuesday morning at the Central Forum, in a specialized court for complex financial crimes, where Judge Dr. Beatriz Campos, known for severe sentences against systematic fraudsters, would preside over proceedings that would determine the legal fate of a man who had destroyed the lives of multiple women during 15 years of calculated predatory activity. I attended the trial accompanied by Patricia, Dr. Amanda, and surprisingly by Fernando, who had become not just a hired investigator but a genuine friend during the process of exposing Mauricio's crimes, and especially during long conversations about how judicial systems frequently fail to adequately protect victims of domestic financial crimes. Regina was also present in the courtroom, sitting discreetly in the benches reserved for witnesses, visibly nervous about having to provide detailed public testimony about how she had been manipulated, and especially about her conscious participation in medical fraud against her own daughter. During the week since our cafe confrontation, she had rigorously fulfilled all terms of the testimonial cooperation agreement, providing extensive written statements, participating in multiple deposition sessions with prosecutors, and especially beginning the financial restitution process through significant monthly transfers that demonstrated genuine commitment to material reparation of the damages caused. Mauricio entered the courtroom escorted by court officers, wearing a professional gray suit that contrasted dramatically with the metal handcuffs on his wrists. He had been preventively arrested 2 weeks earlier when he tried to flee to Paraguay using falsified documents, confirming the profile of a habitual criminal with no intention of facing legal consequences for systematically committed crimes. His facial expression alternated between defensive arrogance when looking at jurors and poorly disguised panic when perceiving the volume of documentary evidence piled on prosecutors' tables representing years of meticulous investigation about his fraudulent activities. Regina's testimony was the most emotionally charged moment of the entire trial. She related in detail for 90 minutes how Mauricio had systematically manipulated her from the initial apparently casual encounter to the devastating moment when she discovered through my evidence that the entire relationship had been a calculated criminal performance. Mauricio made me believe I was the most special woman he had ever met, that he had finally found true love in old age after years of post-divorce loneliness. Regina testified with a voice choked by genuine tears that demonstrated the depth of psychological trauma caused by the discovery of having been a disposable tool in a financial scheme instead of a loved partner in a genuine relationship. He exploited my emotional loneliness, my desperate desire for companionship, and especially my maternal love for my daughter, transforming each personal vulnerability into a weapon he used against me to execute devastating financial crimes. My own testimony focused specifically on the emotional and financial impact of the medical fraud. I described sleepless nights researching oncological treatments, paralyzing anxiety about Regina's supposed terminal condition, and especially the psychological devastation of discovering everything had been an elaborate lie to extract financial resources I had meticulously saved over 15 years of hard work. The most significant damage wasn't just financial. It was $25,000 I can eventually recover through work, but especially the complete destruction of trust and family relationships that should represent the most secure foundation of human existence. I testified, clearly articulating to the jury how Mauricio's crimes had caused profound psychological damages that would extend far beyond legal resolution of the case. Mauricio's defense tried to argue he was also a victim of difficult economic circumstances, of relationships that ended badly, of women who allegedly had misinterpreted genuine romantic gestures as calculated manipulations. But the defensive strategy completely collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of at least 7 different victims during 15 years, demonstrating a systematic criminal pattern that couldn't be explained through romantic misunderstandings or temporary economic circumstances. The photographs of Mauricio posing identically with multiple women, wearing the same clothes and rehearsed romantic gestures, were particularly devastating to any innocence narrative the defense tried to construct. The final sentence pronounced by Judge Dr. Beatriz Campos was severe but appropriate, considering the gravity and systematicity of crimes committed by Mauricio during a decade and a half of calculated predatory activity. Mauricio Henrique Costa Silva. This court sentences you to 12 years imprisonment in an initially closed regime for multiple counts of aggravated fraud, embezzlement, document falsification, gang formation, and especially for violation of previous judicial orders that specifically prohibited establishing romantic relationships with women over 50 years of age. The judge declared with a voice echoing judicial authority accumulated during 2 decades presiding over complex financial crime cases. In addition to the prison sentence, the defendant must pay total financial restitution of $168,000 to the 7 identified victims, divided proportionally based on amounts defrauded from each one. Mauricio's reaction to the severe sentence was an uncontrolled emotional explosion that finally revealed the true nature of a man who had maintained carefully constructed social masks during years of criminal operations. He screamed incoherent accusations about judicial conspiracies, vindictive women, and systematic injustices, needing to be physically removed from the courtroom by multiple court officers, while continuing to vociferate vague threats against witnesses who had provided incriminating testimonies. The pathetic scene of a criminal finally facing inevitable consequences for systematic crimes provided a strange sense of emotional closure. Justice had been served through appropriate legal systems instead of personal revenge, or especially allowing a criminal to continue operating with impunity against future victims. The 6 months following Mauricio's criminal conviction were intensively dedicated to my own emotional recovery, and especially rebuilding a personal identity that had been fundamentally altered by the traumatic experience of being betrayed by a person who should represent unconditional protection in my life. Weekly psychological therapy with specialized psychologist Dr. Carla Mendez became an essential component of this progressive healing process. She helped me process the emotional complexities of maintaining healthy boundaries with Regina, while simultaneously recognizing she had been partially a victim of sophisticated manipulation executed by a professional criminal. Leticia, your mother was simultaneously victim and perpetrator in this situation. Recognizing this complex duality allows developing a balanced emotional response that avoids both destructive hatred and premature forgiveness that could make you vulnerable to future manipulations. Dr. Carla guided me during therapeutic sessions that gradually rebuilt my capacity to selectively trust human relationships. The relationship between Regina and me eventually established itself in a delicate balance of respectful distance with limited but cordial communication. We talked monthly by phone about practical matters related to financial restitution and compliance with legal agreement terms, but carefully avoided emotionally charged topics about the traumatic past, or especially future expectations about rebuilding a maternal relationship that had been irreversibly damaged by conscious criminal choices. I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely forgive what you did, but I recognize you were also a victim of predatory manipulation, and especially I admire the courage to assume responsibility through testimonial cooperation and consistent financial restitution, I told her during one of our monthly phone conversations, establishing realistic expectations about permanent boundaries of our future relationship. Regina graciously accepted these relational boundaries without trying to press for premature reconciliation or undeserved forgiveness, demonstrating genuine psychological growth that had resulted from months of mandatory therapy, and especially volunteer work at the oncological hospital, where she now spent 16 hours weekly assisting real cancer patients and their families. The work at the hospital has been a transformative experience that makes me daily confront the ethical gravity of what I did in falsifying a diagnosis of a disease that causes such devastating suffering to millions of people, Regina shared during one of our conversations, revealing that the creative punishment Dr. Amanda had suggested was having a profound educational impact on Regina's understanding of the moral consequences of her criminal actions. Professionally, my career as a business consultant unexpectedly prospered during the year following the trial, partially because the traumatic experience had taught me valuable skills about identifying psychological manipulation, establishing healthy relational boundaries, and especially about the importance of independently verifying information before making significant financial decisions based exclusively on emotional appeals. I began offering specialized workshops for corporate executives about protection against professional and personal manipulation, using my experience as an anonymous case study that demonstrated how intelligent and successful people can be systematically manipulated when emotional vulnerabilities are strategically exploited by experienced manipulators. Fernando became a genuine close friend during the recovery process, and eventually our professional relationship naturally evolved into romance, based on a solid foundation of mutual respect, honesty demonstrated through consistent actions, and especially absolute transparency about personal histories and emotional vulnerabilities that made both of us cautious but not cynical about possibilities of authentic human relationships. Our story began with investigation about financial crimes, but became a relationship based on shared values about integrity, mutual protection, and especially commitment to never exploit each other's vulnerabilities for personal benefit, Fernando said during a romantic dinner celebrating 1 year since we officially began dating. Financially, I managed to recover approximately 70% of the $25,000 through a combination of Regina's monthly payments according to the restitution agreement, partial compensation from the government through a fund for victims of financial crimes, and especially through intensive additional work during 18 months that allowed me to rebuild the emergency account that had been devastated by elaborate medical fraud. The remaining 30% I consider an involuntary investment in extremely expensive education about human nature, psychological manipulation, and especially about the importance of independently verifying information, even when it comes from people we trust absolutely. Today, 3 years after that devastating morning when I discovered Regina's photographs in Europe, I'm a person fundamentally transformed by the traumatic experience but not destroyed by it. More cautious about trusting quickly but not cynically closed to genuine relationships, more conscious about psychological vulnerabilities but not paralyzed by constant fear of manipulation, and especially more determined to use the painful experience to help other victims of family financial crimes through public advocacy and strategic sharing of lessons learned. Regina's betrayal taught me that biological family doesn't automatically guarantee loyalty or protection, but it also showed me that chosen family, friends like Patricia and partners like Fernando, can provide an even more solid emotional foundation when consciously built on shared values instead of simply passively accepted through accidental genetic bonds. The complete experience taught me a fundamental lesson about human nature that I frequently share with other victims of family crimes. True love never asks for sacrifices that fundamentally harm us or violate our moral integrity, and any relationship that requires such sacrifices through emotional manipulation should be rigorously questioned regardless of how close the family or romantic bond. Regina consciously chose to protect a criminal she had known for 6 months instead of protecting a daughter she raised for 37 years, revealing that even maternal bonds can be completely distorted when people become vulnerable to experienced manipulators and exploiting unsatisfied emotional needs. Did you like Letitia's story? Then subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.